each new hatch we do really only relies on three things, and the math node is what informs where things will go. And then the texture is darkened. In this case, for hatch marks, the texture has to be made on the side. And by the time you're done with it, you can really get some very interesting, good samples of work. And remember that you can use the cycles displacement to get really fantastic marks that are very print-worthy down here without the cost of all those polygons.
Hello. Hi. Hola. And we can get right into it. A lot of Blender versions, including Blender 2.79, will let us do cross-hatching as a post-processing technique, not in the default layout, but in the compositing layout. Before we get to the compositing layout, let's do a thing to see what cross-hatching is. Cross-hatching is simply a two-dimensional technique that illustrates shading by way of, get rid of a couple of things here, by way of ink lines, pen and ink lines that change direction, and they overlap each other as values get darker. And so I'm just going to do a basic cube right here, and then double check my render settings, and I want to make sure that my light paths are way up high so I get all sorts of bounces, and that will offer more values in the render. And I'm going to turn the strength of my background down to 0, and I'm going to put a plane underneath just so we have a ground for it to sit on. There's no material, nothing like that. Control and the left arrow will get you to a compositing editor. Using nodes, I can begin right now, but first we're going to look at textures. We're going to grab data from the world, and we're going to create a new one. The new one is going to be a texture that we put over the render, and then we're going to control how it goes over the render. And then I've got three examples, very different examples that we're going to go ahead and mess with. So first of all, when we click Use Nodes in the Texture Node Tree type, grabbing from World Data, our default is Checker. Now this is not too peculiar, because when we go into the default layout and create a new material, Shift F3 will take us to the node editor, and what do we have? We have a default diffuse material with material output. So this is nothing too spectacular or uncommon. It just happens to be a texture, not a material. So with Node Wrangler enabled, I can change the checker to wood. In order to make sure Node Wrangler is enabled, I can do User Preferences, and in the add-ons, begin typing for the search of Node Wrangler. Mine is on, so that's not a problem. Left-click, select the node you wish to change. Hit Shift-S, and you can switch type. This one's going to be a texture changed to wood. Good. Now, I want the red to turn black. This represents the ink that would be used in the hatching. Band noise for now will become bands. Now I want this named 45. I want these to go at 45-degree angles the other way. There are two ways, you know what, forget it. 45 degrees going the other way. And so, to turn them 90 degrees, I want to hit Shift-A and add a distort node that rotates. Now, I'm still a little new to some of these compositing nodes, so bear with me as I try to remember what I had stumbled onto. Let's see, 0.5, 0.5, and I think 0, and well, that's going to be it. So, if you can see that, turns 0.5. Which axis? All X, no Y, no Z. Good. Now, another distortion is going to be scale, so that we can get this down quite a bit. I've been happy with the scale of 50. Let's see if that works for this one. So I'll left click and drag over the X and Y, and I'll type in 50. And now it's 50 times smaller. When I click back to the compositing node tree type, it'll think about things for a second but not change anything yet. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to treat the texture as though it's a color. And we know how to mix in colors. We go to color, you go to mix, and there it is. So let's put that there. And now we need a new input. That input will be texture. Here's the hashing, but not really. It's an empty node. It needs to be told which texture, and since our library contains only one texture, that should be pretty easy. Please ignore offset, and please ignore scale for now, those two settings that are included in this node. Now I'm going to use the color and inform Blender that I want hashing on that image. Not hashing. I want hatching on that image. It should be noted that there's cross-hatching and there's hatching. If you were to do just hatching, you would have all your lines going the same way, but they would be different thicknesses. Cross-hatching really is perhaps the same size line going in different directions. So I've slipped the image into the factor, and I'm going to change the math node to say less than. And I'm going to put the value to less than 0.7. I'm just guessing. I don't really have to guess. I can look at the image all by itself as a render layer, and I can use my left mouse button and click on a bright spot. In this case, the value is 0.54. So I want my hatching to appear where things are closer to 0. Closer to 0 means closer to black. Closer to black with hatching means that's where the shading goes. So let's read the image and give me hatching where it's less than 4. We don't see it because we're still looking at the render layer, but if I composite it together and then say darken, not mix, it's exactly the same. Neato. There we go. Okay. That's a lot better. Hatching are these lines that go across one direction to indicate shading. It's a really cool two-dimensional effect, and here it's very tidy, and what we can do is make it untidy and change it back to band noise. We won't see the change until we go back to the compositing node tree type, and then Blender will think about it and put it together. We could also go back in and change the scale from being 50 and 50 to being 100 in both values, and I'd also like to tighten it up so it's a higher contrast, and the way I'll do that is by adding a converter, which is a color ramp. You don't really have to put it in between the rotate and the scale nodes, but I choose to do that just to keep it easy. So I put my black at 0.15 and then experiment with putting the white at 0.35. I'll slip back over into the compositing node tree type, and what happens? It's a lot more like pen and ink. And now let's go to some other examples that have more complex shading and more complex shapes. Since we have a basic idea of what cross-hatching is and how we're going to accomplish it, let me just sort of skip back through in the compositing nodes here. I had come close to getting it right and decided then that I could do better, and I was right. So you have your wood node, and then you will add in a distortion of rotate and a distortion of scale, And maybe between the two you'll put in a color ramp. This is called -45, and that is not the way I want to see... Yes, it is the way I want to see -45. I can make a copy of this with Control-C, or use my Copies button down here and go ahead and create... You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the old ones. Here's a 45. Let's get rid of it. There are no users on any others. Okay, so you would create one, get rid of any existing nodes, and then hit Control-V. So -45 is what we're looking at. Now, in order to change it to +45, remember, we can come to the Rotate node and do 0.5 turns along just the x-axis, with the others being 0. And that resulted in that. So now we've got one going this way, and we've got one going that way. Let's get one laying across the bottom, which I would call 180, and let's get one going up and down, which I would call 90. And so in order to get 180 using this node setup, I would do a quarter turn, but it gets a little pickly. I want that quarter turn to be... where do I want it to be? The scale is a little bizarre. Alright, where do I want that quarter turn? Do I want it on a quarter of the x, or do I want it... This is a number between 0 and 1, so it's fishy to me. I might have gotten it. 0.25, 0.25, that doesn't do it, so okay. 0.5 and 0.5. So a quarter turn at 0.5 on the x-axis and the y-axis. Yeah, of course, totally logical. And now, the 90, these are from earlier attempts, just ignore what you see there. I'm going to stick this down, and I'm going to do 3/4 of a turn, and let's just try our luck on that 0.5. Oh! Okay! Well, I can't explain why it is that way, but there it goes. So this was at a scale of 100, and I know that that 180 has been rescaled to 5, so I'll shift that back to 100. Now, let's play with the compositing nodes. We have now our textures set up. Can't see them all at once, we can't change them all at once, but we know that they're there. This scene is a cube, a cone, and a sphere, and a plane, and that plane may or may not actually have a material on it. Shift F3, and it does have a material on it. I'm going to just make it a color right now, and that's going to be fine. So Shift F5 gets back to 3D view, and then Control left arrow. Let's render it with the correct passes. Passes we like include shadow, ambient occlusion, and the color pass from diffuse. Everything else you can just sort of... and the environment. That's always a good one too. And I think I'm doing it at a scale of 100%. And my light paths should be full global illumination, and use whatever render samples you are comfortable with. Oh, and include the lights if they're on a different layer. In my case, they're on layer 1. So I have my environment, light, and camera on layer 1. I have these basic objects on layer 2. And I have a building facade on layer 3. And I have an archway with some park lamps on layer 4. So we're getting to more complicated things for our cross-hatching. And denoise is also something good to enable. I didn't enable it for this, but cross-hatching is going to look at values down to the pixel,
I don't think it samples around a particular pixel. So if we were to look at this at a scale of 1, you could see a lot of pixelation here in the cone. And I believe that this processing looks pixel by pixel instead of sampling a pixel's neighbors. Like you see this dark pixel right here? I don't think it averages the neighbors. I think it looks exactly at that dark pixel. So I will just render this again with the denoising, and we'll see what happens with that dark pixel. Oh boy, denoising took care of that because it evaluates the neighbors. All right. Now, we know it's a smooth image. We're looking only at the image, and if we have our Node Wrangler enabled, we can click Backdrop, and then Control-Shift left-click to view the different outputs of our render passes. I have been enjoying this one, AO, Ambient Occlusion, and I've been using it to inform my cross-hatching. I had been using my cross-hatching on top of the color pass for diffuse, and it looked as though one artist was coloring and another artist was doing cross-hatching. It was actually kind of fun. Let me disable backdrop here, and here it comes, the 45-degree angle hatch, because it's not crossing anything, it's just called a hatch. Here's how we plug this in. We need 3 things. We need the input of that texture. So we'll go right to it and we'll make sure that it gets the 45 degree. Good. We need to mix things. We're going to treat it like color, so I want to mix from the color category. And I also want to do a converter that is math. And this math is going to be a less than argument. And I don't know the values yet, but those 3 are going to be repeated 4 times for cross-hatching that goes across 4 different ways. They'd be repeated 2 times for cross-hatching that only goes across twice. And you decide on the angle. I'm doing what you've seen, 45 minus 45, 180, and 90. So I've got a bunch of perpendiculars. So I'd like to use my ambient occlusion to inform the less than argument. I'll then take that value and use it as a factor. I'd then like to use the color of my texture and use it to darken the white. And the white comes with this node. I don't have to change a thing. I had been using it on top of the diffuse color, but I'm just going to use it on white right now. So what does this look like with the default value here of 0.5? It looks like that. Now, I can make those lines provide more coverage by using the RGB curves, which can be found in color. I want these lines to provide more coverage. So let me mouse wheel drag and then adjust a new point and see if I can get it right on the first 10 tries. Okay, that's 1. There's 2. There's 3. Oh, my, oh dear. I didn't mean for the ground to continue having that, that texture. I was going to, like, surprise you with that later. All right. But this is enough coverage for me where I can still see the highlights of the cube, a pinch of the cone, and a bit of the sphere highlight. So let me do now the minus 45. So left click select with the shift held down, and then shift D, and if you wobble a whole bunch or you're on a sailing vessel, you can constrain this movement, this duplication, to the x-axis by clicking the letter X. I'm going to give myself a little bit of space here. And now I will use the output of ambient occlusion to inform my math node. I will use the old image to be darkened
and I will change the texture from 45 to -45. And then I've been generally taking this down 1 or 1.5 decimals, so we can just put it to 0.4 from 0.5. And now before we see anything, we have to plug in the output. Da-da, 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 da. Oh yeah. Ta-da! Look at that. I probably could have gone down a little bit more, but look how luscious this is. Down here, they're almost like halftones of cross-hatching. Now you've got the general idea. Let's just keep going farther, okay? So I shift left click to get those, shift D, X, whoops, how did I not get them all? Going instead to actually do 0.35. Ha. Okay. Left click, select with that, shift D, pull them over. I'm just eyeballing this distance. Bring the output from the RGB curves into the math node. Use the old image to get mixed. And then I'm just going to pick 90, which is the up and down. And then I'm going to change this by subtracting 0.15. See, I could do math right inside that node. And now I'm going to take the new output and see how it composites. Oh, all right. And now let's do that again. Those three are still selected, so Shift D with an X. Eyeball it out to a certain point. Whoops. Say oops. That's important. Bring the RGB curve output into the math node. Bring the old image of 3 crosshatches into the 4th. Make sure it's darkened. And then switch from 90 to your 4th and final, in this case, 180 degree hatches. And now subtract. Let me see if I can make this bigger for you. Now subtract 0.15, and that should be, I don't even know if anything's going to show up, but that should be pretty tight. And now have a look at your new composited image. Ta-da! It does look a bit pixelated. I think because we chose hundreds, and choosing 100 means that these lines are very, very, very teeny tiny. And I'm just going to double check that this is scaled to 100%. Okay, it is. This is full resolution, 1920 across by 1080 up and down, and the results are useful. Okay, maybe they're not your favorite, but that's the idea. I wanted to save this piece of information for you. Where the hell is that coming from? I must not be looking at the right material. Ground. Ground. Oh, this is... Okay, so here's a good mistake. All these fun nodes. I'm looking at the node editor, right? So I must be looking at the material that is selected over here in the material panel. But if you think that, you'd be wrong. Because look, I'm looking at taking nodes from the world instead of the material. And so that was actually my environment node group. Okay, so this is why the bump is still on the ground. I was going to surprise you with that because the result is all of this detail for two-dimensional stuff and print work and maybe for use on the internet. You get all these great details, but you didn't have to waste any data on polygons. You see? It's just one big polygon on the ground. The caveat is this technique of creating the cross-hatching, it's locked into the screen. It's mapping to the screen. So if we were to animate just a little bit of the camera, it would look a little strange. I'll do that for you right now. I don't know. I don't know if you can see anything from that, but it maps to the screen. It does not follow the objects, but it is... it's quite a seizure, isn't it? Why don't we just stop that? Okay, good. Now you've seen it animated. It's not the end of the world, but it's not ideal. And now I have the camera waiting for us here in front of a house facade. Now that my preview samples are set to 0, it's just going and going and going in the preview here with Shift Z in the 3D view layout. I'm going to go to a new slot here, slot 2, and I'm going to render this. I have created this scene to fail. We were using ambient occlusion to inform the math node for crosshatching. This is using dramatic lighting in the scene to create the look of night. That is a pretty good looking image of crosshatching, but it no longer looks like nighttime. So we don't have to use ambient occlusion to inform RGB curves and math nodes of how to crosshatch. We can use the image itself. And especially that's a good idea if we're doing something very dramatic with lighting. There's no big environment light and the environment is turned to 0. The only lights in this scene are the house light outside and the material that I used for the windows. Now that's very dark. I can now, instead of changing all the math node numbers, change my RGB curves. This is default. That's sort of like straight across with no effect. The bricks are beginning to come through, but what my goal is to see the door. So I'm just going to lift this until that doorknob comes through, and lift it some more until the doorknob comes through, and lift it some more. Yeah, you get it. What I have waiting for us over here on layer 4, with a new camera position that is animated at frame 20, is an archway. This archway has no material, and it has no light. Shift 1 to include that light. There it is denoising right before it puts on the crosshatches, and it's using the image, not the ambient occlusion. And there is the render straight through. I was going to get fancy and make dark lampposts and a brick texture on the arch, and then decided the house facade was fancy enough. I'm going to lower this a bit and see what effect that has on everything. There we go. So, okay, it doesn't have a lot of balance. It doesn't have a lot of... My camera's awfully high. I thought I'd set that low. I did set it low, and then I didn't animate it. I didn't lock it in. Okay. What I want to do with this is direct attention, more or less, into the inside. And the way I can do that, I am going to change these lampposts. I'm going to give them a material that's a bit dark. Let me just call it lamp post. The choice of using ambient occlusion to inform the math nodes is pretty cool, because it won't worry about material types or material colors. Now here, yeah, there they are, all nice and dark. Okay, now I've got something a little bit better to show you. I want this to be lighter around the edges because I want attention drawn more to the center of the arch than to these corners with these rather, ASCII art looking lampposts. So one way to do that is to fudge what's coming out of RGB curves by mixing it with a gradient that will presumably relax our hash marks toward the edges. It doesn't want to give me a gradient, so I'm going to have to do it myself. A radial gradient from foreground to background, and make sure that it's coming out of the center. This is 1080 by 1080. Here we are in GIMP, and I can show the grid. Then I can control the grid. Configure the grid, please. what did I say? 1080, 1080. It sounds like 108 to me. All right, let's just do 108, and I should be able to snap to it if that's active. There. I'm making it a square because I can just distort it in a moment. I'm gonna do it there. Okay. Now I can use GIMP and view. Where's view? I'm on it. Show. Stop showing. Thank you. And now image. Change the scale of the image. Don't tie the width to the height and say 1920 by 1080, and it stretches to the HD stuff. I can arrange by date here and see the gradient that I made for compositing. That image as a single image is right there. Let me bring that image in. Let me mix it with this. And the way I mix it with that is by dragging this in and then control left click. That's not going to work well. For the output, come on. There we go. This is a mix of one. So obviously, no. But if we say overlay, it will it will blow up the arch into a black hole where the Guardians of the Galaxy wait to save everyone. So there's screen, which means that the black won't do anything, but now we have a bit of a vignette here, and we can tone that down, of course, by putting another RGB curves instance in its path and just leaving it the way it was. It's a bit of a clean edge here, and I think that's kind of silly, but the point is now I can knock the white down a little bit and make sure that the darks are darker. That may have been the wrong direction. Yes, it was. All right, make sure the darks are darker, and our environment is chewed to pieces because of the cloud in the environment that we used. And now when I change the background color and hook up all the little nodes I had before, doop, what we're looking at, and your computer may or may not make that doop noise, what we're looking at is a gradient texture, plain and simple. It is mapped so that it comes from the bottom, and I mapped that as a texture with the rotation of 90 degrees on the Z, and I lifted the location on the y-axis by 0.3. The result is what you see here. Oh, and the vector is also just to the window. So I think that's pretty easy to see. This way, if the camera moves, the horizon here is always with the camera. I know that in real life the sky is darker up on top, but since I'm doing like an illustrated thing, I wanted the horizon to be darker rather than lighter. Then I wanted to break it up, so I added noise, and that noise is squished as a texture along the z-axis by way of scale, so it looks like clouds on a horizon. And I just did 4 and 4 for the scale and detail in my noise texture using the factor, so I wouldn't get colors, I would just get that. I used a color ramp to compress the black a little bit and make it darker, and the final result is a black and white sky. If you use just a straight gradient, then you'll get these terribly straight lines in the back, which are very, very unappealing. But this is the beginning of something that you may find useful for some of your projects. I've seen a lot of artwork where basically the manga art is very like cross-hatched and very pretty, and I think a lot of people are trying to do something with that.
And so that is my 2 cents. And so I don't remember. We didn't have anything on slot 1. So are you ready to re-examine slot 1? It's real bright because the environment came along. And so we can, of course, darken things down to get some of the richness of our cross-hatching restored. And darken things down just a bit more. Did I mention it might take 10 tries on the RGB curves? Okay, there's enough information to show the cross-hatching. And then here's, again, what it looks like with diffuse color being that which is darkened. Ta-da! Like a comic book. Very successful in areas like this down here. I hope that you're somewhat inspired, or you can take this and run with it. Now, there you have it. Okay. I appreciate your follows and your nice comments. I hope that this crazy node group is something you can make use of. So there you have it. I'm all done. Thank you for watching.